Okay, welcome everyone to Democracy in Our Time. As Les said, this is the first part of a two-part series, and I want to start off by talking about a trip that I made to Germany with my wife back in 2018. And while we were there, we visited two Stasi centres. They're now museums, one in Berlin and one in Dresden. I was already familiar with the Stasi past history, their unique and pervasive methods of repressing East Germans. This is before the wall came down. The Stasi represented the sharp edge of communist rule and was all-consuming, where private becomes public, as depicted in the excellent 2006 film, The Life of Others, and in Anna Funder's 2002 book, Stasi-Land. However, visiting the Stasi buildings and seeing firsthand their methods and tools of surveillance, visiting prisoner cells, and reading about their pervasive, I should say, effects on the lives of ordinary people brought home to me the horrors of the perverse mind of state authorities when their powers are misused and when they are not held to account. We see here the huge network in the map that you can see on screen. Huge network of Stasi officers spread throughout East Germany prior to the Berlin Wall coming down. In comparison, Hitler's and Stalin's use of agents and police to spy and control on their respective populations is relatively small compared to Honecker's Stasi, who had one agent for every 63 citizens. And as you can see, Hitler's ratio was 1 to 2,000 and Stalin's was 1 to 5,830. Can this ever happen again, where surveillance is easier to realise today with modern advanced technologies? When a state turns these insidious powers to use against its own citizens, we should all be concerned and worried. This is why, for me, ensuring that we continue to live in a stable and functional democracy is of overwhelming importance. In this presentation, what I want to do is identify some key issues within a small segment of the massive literature on democracy. My primary objective is to introduce you to the issues that we can use to kickstart a conversation about the importance of the concept, and to continue this discussion next time with a more focused approach on popularism and digital technology and what those things mean for democracy. For some of you, issues that I raise here may already be familiar to you, but for others they may not. Either way, your input will be appreciated, and my role is simply to start the conversation. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about what is democracy, including a few historical developments. I'm going to talk about Madisonian democracy. That's within the American tradition. I want to also talk about two types of liberties that will be relevant to our discussion about democracy. I want to discuss the benefits of democracy before turning to a few contemporary themes picked up by some recent contemporary academics in this area. And then I want to just summarise what I mean by the idea of democracy with a few concluding comments. Okay. So the first question is, how widespread is democracy? Is it widespread? Is it in general use? Now, in my view, it is widely used around the world. It has widespread appeal, and it's got emotional appeal too. People have fought in wars and died in wars on the basis of trying to advance or defend democracy. However, there is a wide usage of the term democracy, and as we can see, as I alluded to earlier, the East Germans used the term German Democratic Republic when discussing their system, and as I would argue, this is completely inappropriate. It didn't represent democracy at all, in my view. Has the term democracy become an hurrah word? Is it devoid of meaning? Well, if you use it in this sense, it probably has. But what I want to do tonight is I want to define. I want to define more clearly, although it's very difficult to define in very precise language because you've got different interpretations. But I want to discuss what we mean by democracy. And the meaning of democracy should be distinguished from any moral or normative appeal. The two are different. Okay. Democracy, most people would argue that it comes from, it's got Greek origins. I've come across some authors that say that it predates the Greeks, but we'll assume for this presentation that the Greeks invented the concept, and Athens in the 4th and 5th century BCE is considered as the role model, if you like, the ideal. And basically it means the people rule. But if we were to look at Athens at the time, ancient Athens, we probably wouldn't consider it to be a true democracy, even though people hold it up to be the ideal. When you sort of look at the people consisted of adult citizens. It excluded women, children, slaves, and foreigners. And you had to be over 18 to partake in the assembly, and you had to be over 30 to hold an office, an admin or magistrate office. The concept of rule, that applied to direct participation. So you were expected as a citizen to participate actively in the activities. So if we look at the system overall, it had various checks and balances against the potential abuse of power. Regions were equally represented, and citizens were chosen at random for executive, magistrate and other positions with a strict time limit. And participation was considered a civic duty. It was a way of gaining virtue. So if you didn't partake, you were more or less considered useless, as the quote down here mentions. So if we look at the ancient form of democracy and what we've got today, the ancient form is not practical, it's not viable in a modern state. The Athenian democracy was able to work because of the small numbers, the territory was small. It was able to work, by the way, because of slavery, because it freed up people to attend full day sessions in Athens to debate. And they used to meet, they had to meet at least once a month, but typically it was 2 or 3 times a month, plus the other duties that they had on top of that. Indirect democracy or representative democracy, on the other hand, is what we have got. It's the modern form. It's the form where elected representatives make decisions on behalf of constituents, or they make decisions with the consent of the constituents. It depends how you look at it. Historically, democracy, it's only in sort of modern times that it's been considered an ideal, something to look up to. Prior to the 19th century, it was a maligned and term that was held in contempt. Plato, the Renaissance thinkers, even the founding fathers of the US Constitution had problems with it. And we'll go into the latter bit in a few minutes. The turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century saw democracies in the US in particular working reasonably effectively and fairly, producing stable government. One of the biggest problems with previous attempts was that democracies were not, didn't have a long life, and they produced unstable government. And that was one criticism and concern that people had. And also the issue about minorities, how minorities could be looked after. Since then, as well, since the 19th century, the concept of citizenship has increased over time, and now essentially the term is associated with universal suffrage, where everyone's got the vote. That's every adult person, male, female, and it's seen as a basic characteristic of democracy. Okay. So some definitions. I've got three here. I'm not saying that any of these are definitive. This is a sample just to give you a sense of what some of the authors are grappling with and where they're coming from. The first one by Schumpeter really focuses on methods and procedures. It's a market-based perspective, and if you look at it closely, it's more concerned with the leaders obtaining votes from people. It's considered a competitive struggle to gain people's votes. And this particular definition really challenges the classical Greek perspective. The one in the middle, which is by a couple of academics at Harvard in a recent book, and I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail later, they talk about the importance of elections, the importance of elections being free and regular and fair, but also they add in the basic civil liberties as being very important. They highlight that. And the third one is by Holden, who has written a fairly extensive book on democracy from a philosophical perspective. And he considers it to be a political system where the whole people, and by whole, he uses that term so that it encompasses both individuals as well as the communal aspect of the people. And there's a big debate going on in terms of whether the people should be considered as individuals or as part of a communal whole. And there's problems with the latter, and we'll touch upon this next time because that sort of goes into more of what popularism is about, but that's for a later subject. The thing I like about this definition is that it includes both positively and negatively, meaning that people give both consent, but they can also reject. And in this particular case, it's elected officials can be kicked out of office. And I think that's pretty important. What I feel less comfortable with is this latter part of the definition where it says the basic determining decisions on important matters of public policy. I don't think that individual electors make determining decisions on important matters of public policy. I think they elect representatives who have a bundle of policies that may or may not be implemented once they get into power, if they get into power. So that sort of raises a whole lot of issues. But the other aspect that I do like is that it's about the whole people that make and are entitled to make these decisions. So they're there, there's an entitlement, there's a legitimacy for the people to partake in some sort of decision making. Okay, so you know it's useful to sort of compare different definitions because it gives you a different perspective and comparison. Okay, so that's the definitional part, and we will touch upon some of the concepts that come out of that later. What I want to do now is talk about the American type of democracy, and Madison, James Madison, in addition to being the 4th president of the United States, was also one of the key founding fathers. And for him, and this, he made several contributions in what's called the Federalist Papers, which are still well referenced today. And the Federalist Papers were there, published in newspapers to convince people that adopting the US Constitution was a good thing. So they ran a campaign and they published these essays that there were three founding fathers who used this mechanism, and Madison was a very important part of that process. His major concern was that the major concern was about factions, the effective factions. And factions for him was a group with, as you can see on the slide here, some common impulse of passion or of interest, advancing its own interests to the detriment of those of other groups. At the time, this was a deeply pejorative term. Okay, so the way Madison handled it was in his paper, he talks about addressing this factionalism problem by either removing the causes or addressing the effects. And he dismissed removing the causes because he said liberty would need to be curtailed, and that was not acceptable. And you know, men, and they were always talking about men at that time, had a diversity of faculties. And one of the main concerns that he had about factionalism was that he wanted to protect property rights. Okay, so the founding fathers were concerned that the minority, i.e. property right owners, might be disadvantaged if everyone got the vote. So they wanted to put something in place to protect the minority. And what Madison proposed was a two-pronged thing. One of them was what I call sociological, and the other one was an institutional solution. And we'll talk about that here. So there was a need to guard parts of society against so-called injustices from other parts. And he referred to the multiplicity of interests that are impermanent and shifting. So basically he was saying, look, there's a multitude of interests out there and they could be held by the majority, but these interests are not, they're not fixed. They're moving, they're not permanent, they're shifting all the time. So the dangers of having a majority override a minority is probably not too significant, because you know what could be a majority now today around one issue may be different. They may be a minority later on a different issue. So he said that you know that was something that related to how society was structured, and he thought that would counterbalance the various interests of majority versus minority people, groups, I should say. The other one which he proposed, the other aspect, was the institutional structural. And he used this quote, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So basically what he's saying is if you set up structures in the Constitution to counteract ambitions of different groups of people, you will get a better outcome. And one of the systems was the federal system. So it's the same as what we've got in Australia, national, state and local jurisdictions. They would counterbalance each other. And the other aspect was a separation of powers amongst the branches of national government. So you've got the executive, in America's case, it's the president, the legislature, which is the two houses of parliament, and the judiciary. So that's the separation of powers, or the checks and balances, as he would put it. So that's that. Now, I just want to refer very quickly to the distinction that he made in that particular paper, referring to pure democracy versus a republic. The American Constitution doesn't refer to democracy, it refers to a republic. And Madison made a reference to pure democracy, and he's basically referring there to the ancient Greek type, Athens type democracy. Direct democracy, small groups of people, even that didn't cure the problem of factionalism. And there was a risk to personal security and property rights in that system. And essentially, with Athenian democracy, the concern was not about, not so much about individual liberties. It was more about creating a stable city-state that was stable. That's where the founding fathers of the American Constitution thought that democracies were not stable. They were short-lived, and that was the problem with them. So Madison's approach was a representative government that could stretch across large territories and involve many different groups of citizens and large groups of citizens. And there was a promise there that it would address the factionalism problem. And basically it would do this by refining and enlarging the public views. So by having larger territories, more citizens involved in the discussion, you're going to get different cross sections of interests and viewpoints, and that's going to counterbalance the majority versus the minority issue that I spoke about. Also, the chosen representatives were assumed to have some sort of greater wisdom, and they would rule in the general interest of the country. But in that, he also recognised that there was a possibility that elected representatives might betray the general interests of the people. But at the end of the day, he came down on the side of this Republican model is more favourable to public well-being than not having one. Okay, so that's the American hybrid. So essentially, the way I look at it is you've got pure democracy, which is the direct type of democracy, and republicanism, which is the representative style of democracy. And even today, you'll hear a lot of Americans talking about the republic and also about democracy, and they use it interchangeably. Okay, one political activist, he was a Swiss French political activist and writer, came from the Romanticism era, and he wrote he gave an influential speech, a lecture in 1816, and he drew the distinction between the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. The liberty of the ancients was essentially the Greeks, with the Greek democracy approach, where public freedom worked in small city-states. There was an active and constant participation in collective discussion, collective power, and there was a concern for the state to be free. So to be free, you belong to a state that was free, and you had to guard against invasions and other people taking over the state. That was their principal concern. It wasn't about individual liberties as such. Whereas Constant refers to the liberty of the moderns as the individual rights of expression, association, religion, being subject to laws, not on an arbitrary basis, and exercising some influence over government. But at the end of the day, even though he contrasted the two, he came down on the side of both being important. Because basically he said, if you retreat into a life of where you just want to be left alone and you want to express whatever views you want to associate in whatever way you want. If you do that and you don't participate actively in the public forum, eventually the state will become coercive and your liberties maybe in the private sphere may be taken away. So essentially the paradox of modern life was you need to pay attention to what's going on in the public sphere, because if you don't, things are going to creep into the private stuff as well. So you need to be concerned with both. You can't just do one without the other. Okay. Another influential writer was Isaac Berlin in the 1950s. Berlin was a professor at Oxford, a political professor or political philosophy professor. And he came up with the two concepts of negative and positive liberty. And essentially, negative liberty is what we probably most associate with when we talk about liberty or freedom. And it's the liberty from something. We don't want to be interfered with. In terms of the state, we want the state to have limitations, few restrictions on the individual. Whereas positive freedom is more about self-mastery, self-realization, being able to do things. And in terms of the state, it may be that the state needs to intervene at the individual and collective level so that people will have a basic education, for example, or will have basic health care. And without that, you don't necessarily have negative liberty. Negative liberty may not be as important if you don't have some of the basic things that a society can provide to you. But at the end of the day, the two can be rivals, they can be incompatible. And one example that I've got there that I'll quickly go through, if I want to buy a house in Melbourne, there's no restrictions here for me to buy a house. There's no legal restriction or whatever. If you go back to Nazi Germany, they may have had restrictions on religion and stuff like that. So it depends what your race was. You may not have been able to purchase a house or done certain things. So that negative freedom could have been curtailed. Whereas on the positive side, if I want to buy a house, I need to have money to buy a house, the specific house I want to buy. So on the positive side, you've got to have the means by which you can buy a house. But on the negative side, you want to make sure that there aren't restrictions stopping you from doing that. So what Berlin basically said was, look, most people take a simple concept like liberty, but there's a whole lot of hidden plurality behind the idea and the meaning, and we need to flesh it out because it's not a simple concept. And I'm raising it here because liberty, in both Constant and Berlin's sense, are important to the discussion of democracy. Okay. And now I want to look at the benefits of democracy, and I've got it in 2 slides here. I've got the benefits of the democratic process, and I've got the beneficial results of the democratic process. So one is about results, and the first one here is about the process itself. So the process itself leads to virtue. There's virtues in participating in civic life, and the people here, Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, and Benjamin Constant, all had views along these lines, linking the individual to community is very important to them, because if you do that, the individual gets to appreciate other people's points of views, as well as the community as a whole. You know, how decisions are made, rather than having some narrow, myopic view about things. Also, by participating in political life, there's an educative role. And there's 2 aspects to this. One is a very narrow one. It's just basically getting information, what's going on, what's the news out there. And the second one is broader, and both Rousseau and John Stuart Mill were much keener on this, in developing a responsible and moral personality. So a person would grow into a fully rounded person by participating in political life. In terms of the results of the democratic process, we can see that there's beneficial, that there's better decision making that happens. Each individual knows their own interests better than anyone else's. That's the idea. And it's like the wearer principle. Only the wearer knows where the shoe pinches. Okay, and this idea is also you can start to see it in utilitarian democratic theory. They build on this particular idea, and this idea is based on the idea that citizenship is made up of individuals. It doesn't focus on the communal aspect of the people. Another benefit is safeguarding against corruption and sinister interests. So the premise here is that citizens will be endangered if power is left unfettered. So the old adage, power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's what's behind that idea. And finally, and these aren't the only benefits, but these are the main ones that I have fleshed out. Minimising conflict, the opportunity to debate, to associate, to be able to persuade someone else towards your own point of view, that tends to minimise conflict, and particularly violent conflict. So that's important. From my background in, from organisations and negotiations, what you want to do is you want to involve people. When you've got options, you want to involve them in problem solving, because if they've had an input into that problem solving process, you're more likely to get a better outcome, and you're also more likely to get an outcome that is implementable. So if everyone's had a part to play in it, they're going to own it more. And that's the concept behind this. And finally, there's also what's important in democratic processes. It's not just democratic processes, but particularly democratic process is the electoral process, where you can have peaceful transfer of power. Okay, and that's important as well. All right, I'm going to stop there. How we going to do now is I'm going to turn to, I had more than 2 books, but I just found the presentation getting too long. So I've reduced it. There's two sets of authors that I want to touch upon briefly. One is A.C. Grayling, that most of you would probably be familiar with. He's a British philosopher. And the other 2 here are, and I always have trouble saying their names, Levitsky and Zimplatt, both from Harvard University. Stephen, the first author, they're both from politics, government background, both professors. And Stephen specialises in Latin American countries, and Daniel specialises in Western European countries. And what they've done is they've come together to write this book, How Democracies Dies, because they've seen a lot of democracies come and go in their respective fields. And they got very concerned when Trump came to office, and they decided to take their experience and knowledge in those two spheres and look to see how it applied to the US. So it's a very interesting book, easy to read. I would recommend it. And also AC Grayling, easy to read as well. And AC Grayling was also moved by Trump coming to office, and also the Brexit debate and issue. And, you know, both sets of authors basically are concerned with the way democracy's heading. And you can tell that from the title of the two works. Now, there's a whole lot of other works that have recently been published with variants to these themes, but all concerned with democracy and concerned about democracy coming unstuck. But let me just focus on these two. So Grayling, he basically, this slide, if you were to take what Madison was talking about in his democracy or republicanism, it's very similar to what Grayling's saying here. So Grayling's saying, look, there's a tension between achieving democracy. He's talking about unqualified democracy or ancient type of democracy, and ensuring sound and stable government. He calls that the dilemma of democracy, to have democracy plus sound and stable government. And he's basically saying the resolution, as with Madison, is with republicanism or representative democracy. People are the ultimate source of political legitimacy. It doesn't come from above or somewhere else, it comes from the people. And there's an agreed and recognised process for electing the legislature and the government or the executive, and the majority will endorse the government, as well as being able to dismiss them. And there are structures and institutions in place that restrain people in office. So it's almost word for word what Madison would have told us about when he's talking about republicanism in the US. So according to Grayling, democracies in both the US and the UK are in need of rescuing. And he cites Brexit and Trumpism as, symptoms. The checks and balances are not working very well. And according to him, sound government is not just about stability, it's about justice, it's about enabling, considering, having an inclusive government. Okay, so it's not just about a minority or a majority, it's trying to bring people together, which I think Brexit and Trump have acted in the opposite directions. Grayling also makes a series of recommendations, and he's saying these could be, I'm not sure if he uses the word easily, but I don't think they're very easily achieved. But he's saying if these were put in place, they would go a long way in addressing some of the problems that we've got in modern democracies, particularly in the US and the UK. I'm not going to dwell on these, but if people like, we can discuss these when we have our discussion towards the end. But basically, we're talking about transparency of election campaigning, fact-checking, banning betting on elections, polling to cease for a period prior to election day. I remember newspapers in Australia, the media in Australia was not able to report, I think it was 48 hours before an election. When I was young, I remember that happening. Compulsory voting for all citizens. We've got compulsory voting in Australia. We are one of the rare places, even New Zealand doesn't have compulsory voting. And I tend to favour that. Voting age lowered to 16. I'm not sure about that. It's a bit too young, I think. Maybe that shows my age. Obligatory civic education. I think that's a plus. This is one of the things that came out earlier on, that civic education is vital for participating in political discourse. It's both an outcome, and I think it works in the other way. If you've got civic education in schools, you might contribute to students as they grow older to be more and better informed. Proportional representation. Both the US and the UK have got first past the post. I don't know how familiar you are with election processes, but I'm happy to discuss that in more detail. There are some dangers with first past the post. You can get people with minority votes getting into office using that system, and that is a problem. And then you've got party discipline. And party disciplines in the UK, the US, and in Australia are fairly strong, probably more so in the UK and Australia. But the US, with Trump coming to power, he's made it much harder for people to dissent from what he wants. So that is a big problem as well. So, like I said, I won't dwell on these for now, but if people want me to elaborate or you want to have a discussion about it, we can come back to this. Okay, the other two authors, I'll call them Stephen and Daniel because that's easier to say. They have studied authoritarian behaviour, and they've come up with 4 indicators. And I won't go through the details here because you can read about these at your own leisure. These slides, by the way, are available after this presentation. The first one is rejection of democratic rules of the game, denial of legitimacy of political opponents, tolerance or encouragement of violence, steadiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. If you look through these, and if you followed closely what's been happening during Trump's 3 and a bit years in office, you could arguably say that Trump has been involved in all of these. People may dispute it, but I think there is evidence there that you can draw examples of where these things have been crossed or almost crossed these lines. Okay, what these 2 authors say, ask a question, is democracy in the US in danger? What they point out is that democracies have tended to break down from within, not from military intervention from outside since the end of the Cold War. Paradoxically, authoritarians use the institutions of democracy to gradually and subtly take over and then eventually kill the system. And you've got plenty of examples. They give lots and lots of examples in their book, starting with Hitler back in the 1930s. He came through the ranks, and I think Mussolini as well. They both came through the ranks of a democratic process. There was quite a bit of thuggery going on in the background as well, but they used the democratic process to gain legitimacy. But more recently, Latin America And even in European countries, you see this happening, you know, in Hungary, in the Philippines, in Turkey. There's been a gradual erosion of civil liberties and so forth. And I like this quote from the authors: American politicians now treat their rivals as enemies, intimidate the free press, and threaten to reject the results of the elections. They try to weaken institutional buffers of our democracy, including the courts, intelligence services, and ethics officers. Okay. And they also talk about 3 strategies that authoritarian leaders use: capturing referees, sidelining key players, rewriting the rules to tilt the playing field against the opposition. And once again, arguably, Trump has attempted to use all 3. And I've given here some examples. I didn't spend too much time coming up with the examples. They were pretty easy to find. And I think that the list could go on and on if you looked hard enough. Another important aspect of Stephen and Daniel's book is that the checks and balances that we were talking about before in the US political system, they're saying they've worked reasonably well. The Constitution has got a framework built in for checks and balances. But the failure has not been in the constitutional framework itself. The problem has been with the that the unwritten democratic norms haven't been reinforced. That these checks and balances, if they work to the letter of the law, it would probably make the function of government inoperable in the US. You'd have gridlock. And we're already starting to see that. You know, budgets being blocked and they have to go into emergency sessions so that public servants can be paid money because the US government's going to run out of money. That's happening more and more often. The executive powers that the president has got, that's being used more and more. You know, it wasn't just Trump, but Obama was using executive orders more and more because he wasn't able to get through the legislation through the Houses of Parliament. With Obama, one of these examples is, I think it was almost 1 year before he left office, his appointment to the Supreme Court was blocked. Now, as far as I know, that's never happened, not that far out from an election. And the Republicans blocked it by saying, no, you've got to wait until the election. But the election's almost 12 months away. But they blocked it. And then when Trump got into power, he appointed a Supreme Court justice. And since then, he's appointed 2 others, I think. So there's unwritten norms that have been broken. And what the 2 authors are saying is what's critical is you've got to have mutual toleration. The opposing parties have to accept that the other rival is legitimate. And Trump was there during the election campaign saying that Hillary Clinton should be locked up. And there's a bit of that going the other way now, but not as much. But you know, there needs to be recognition that your opposition, this is a democracy. In democracies, we have oppositions. They are legitimate. And forbearance. Politicians exercise restraint in the use of institutional prerogatives and rights. So this goes to the issue of, you know, the executive orders that I was talking about and the appointment of Supreme Court justices. By the way, the appointment of the Supreme Court justices, just as in Australia, the appointment of the High Court justices is vital because the highest court of the land usually makes very, very important decisions that go to interpretation of laws and how those laws are applied. And they can't be appealed. And that can change the balance of power, if you like. It's certainly, you know, if you look at the history of Australian politics, it's certainly changed the whole landscape in Australia. Whereas during Federation, the federal government had very little power, for example. They didn't raise much income, for example. Funds were not raised essentially by the federal government. It was raised by the states. And since then, it's almost been spun around, and the federal government is the predominant government in Australia, and the states have got reduced powers. And that's simply happened over time with the reinterpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution hasn't changed. We've had referenda that not many have got through. The Constitution hasn't changed, but the interpretation of the Constitution has. And it's the same in America. The way the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution and other legislation is critical. And if you've got the numbers stacked in your favour, and that's what Trump is doing, that can have a significant effect on outcomes. And then I think finally, what Stephen and Daniel talk about is that America is deeply divided. And in one place, they talk about an existential threat. And remember, this was written in 2018, but they're saying particularly the issue of race is a very important one. And the historical backdrop there is the Civil War. It's still there in the imagination of a lot of Americans. Lessons from history: extreme polarisation can kill democracies. You need that people to be able to come together to make the systems of government work. If you've got polarisation, conflict, the institutions will start to degrade. Okay, so now getting to the principal question, the idea of democracy, is it useful? I think it is, but we need a mutual understanding of what we mean by democracy in a modern state. And these are just some points. Once again, it's not comprehensive. These are just some of the points that I've picked up from the literature and my own input. It's not just a system for electing representatives. It's more than that. But you need free and fair and regular elections. That's the bedrock of democracy. And the citizenry needs to be able to remove governments. That's critical if they're not performing or they're not in keeping with what people want. It's a package. The rule of law, it can't be arbitrary. You've got to respect and protect civil liberties and human rights. And you've got to have freedom of association. You've got to have freedom of the press, freedom to organise, etc. Institutional and structural checks and balances, as we've seen, are important, but they need to be reinforced with the unwritten democratic norms. Political leaders need to act with mutual tolerance and forbearance. Overall interests of the people need to be taken into account, not just the majority. And you've got to have government, governments need to remember that they rule with the consent of the people. They shouldn't be going beyond that. And Churchill's got the last word, or almost the last word. So the key passage here is, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. So I'm going to come back to the Stasi. One of the first photos I took when I went to the museum in Berlin was this van, and it reminds me of I call it the milk van. There was no signage on it. This is what they used to use, especially at night, to pick up political prisoners, remove them from their houses and plonk them in here so they wouldn't be as conspicuous. And then you'd be driven off to a prison. So for me, that's quite telling. It's about minimising the risk of states becoming too powerful and coercive. We have to be vigilant, and we've got to take an active interest in our politics, even if we prefer to retreat into our own private affairs. And that's essentially Benjamin Constant's warning. So I'll leave you with that. But one final thing is the part 2. The jury is still out as to whether democracy's days are numbered. I think it's going to be around for some time yet, but it's not a given. We shouldn't take it for granted. That's all I'm saying. We should be taking a much more active role in keeping our politicians honest. The next presentation, what I want to do, I want to focus on 2 things. Popularism. So this goes to the issue of what are the people? Who are the people? Is it one corporate entity, as a lot of populist leaders would like us to imagine, and they know what's best for the corporate group of people? And the other one is digital technology. That's got a pervasive effect on the way we behave and operate in a democratic country. And we can see our rights being taken away incrementally through digital technology. So I want to focus on those 2. And in the second talk, I'm going to talk more about Australian democracy, which I know more about.